Welcome to Before the Store. In the humid depths of 19th century America, some truths were not meant to be buried, but to be dissolved. This is the macabre story of the Louisiana doctor who fed his patients to the swamp, a hidden secret from 1844 that turns the act of healing into a terrifying ritual of sacrifice. The mystery begins not with a disappearance, but with a discovery made over a century later. A sealed cistern of human bones and a plaque bearing a chilling epitaph. This is the case of a hospital that never healed anyone, a place where a man of science appointed himself the high priest of a dark, primordial faith, and the Bayou itself became his altar. How did a respected physician, educated in the finest institutions of Europe, come to believe that the murky waters of the Louisiana swamp held the key to spiritual purification? What truly happened within the walls of the Sanatorium du Marais, a place from which no patient ever returned alive? The answers lie scattered in waterlogged archives and in the earth itself, revealing a horrifying tale that official history tried to forget and that science, for a time, refused to study. This is the dark secret of Dr. Alphonse Delacroix and the swamp that kept his counsel. Before we descend into the Bayou's hidden past, we invite you to become part of our community of historical investigators. If you value these deep explorations into the forgotten corners of history, please subscribe to Before the Store and enable all notifications so you never miss an uncovering. Like this video to help us in our mission to bring these important stories out of the shadows. And now, let us know in the comments from what part of the world you are joining us to uncover this story tonight. The story surfaces in the summer of 1962, pulled from the grasping mud of St. Landry Parish, Louisiana. A team of archaeologists from Louisiana State University, surveying land for a proposed canal, struck iron where there should have been only soil and cypress roots. What they unearthed was not a relic of the Civil War, nor a forgotten piece of farm equipment, but a large square cistern, its iron lid sealed shut with rust and time. It took the better part of a day to pry it open, the sound of grinding metal echoing over the still black water of the adjacent bayou. The air that escaped was thick with the scent of ancient decay, a smell far older and more profound than that of the swamp itself. Inside, beneath a layer of stagnant water, lay a tangled collection of objects that defied immediate explanation. There were dozens of surgical instruments, scalpels, forceps, and bone saws of a mid-19th century design, all coated in a corrosive patina. Mingled with them was a slurry of softened organic matter that, upon later analysis, was identified as human bone, dissolved by over a century of acidic immersion. It was a mass grave, but one curated with a strange, clinical precision. The most unsettling artifact, however, was found fused to the underside of the lid. A corroded bronze plaque, its elegant script still hauntingly legible. The inscription read, "To those whom science could not heal, the swamp received." These words provided the first clue to a local history that had long ago passed into the realm of ghost stories. The cistern was located on the former grounds of the Sanatorium du Marais, a private institution that had operated for a brief, terrible period in the 1840s. Official parish records from the era are sparse, mentioning the sanatorium only as having been founded by a Dr. Alphonse Delacroix and later destroyed in a catastrophic flood. But this discovery, this buried evidence of a clinical massacre, suggested the flood was not the only tragedy to befall this place. The unearthing of the cistern prompted a new, more urgent search through the colonial archives in Baton Rouge, a hunt for documents that could explain the bones. Researchers sifted through brittle property deeds, parish ledgers, and forgotten correspondence, seeking the name Delacroix. What they found was a collection of letters, their ink faded to a ghostly brown, written by a young man named Etienne Roussel. He identified himself as the personal assistant to Dr. Delacroix, and his letters, addressed to a brother in New Orleans, would become the primary testimony of the horrors that unfolded at the sanatorium. Roussel's early correspondence, dated October 1843, paints a portrait of his employer as a figure of immense intellectual charisma. Dr. Alphonse Delacroix was a French Creole physician of considerable standing, educated in Paris with a brief, distinguished practice in the hospitals of Lyon, before returning to his native Louisiana. He was a man of science, but also a man of profound, almost mystical philosophy. He spoke of the untamed Louisiana landscape not as a wilderness to be conquered, but as a living entity, a force of nature with its own primordial wisdom, capable of both creating life and absorbing its corruptions. The Sanatorium du Marais was the physical manifestation of Delacroix's philosophy. He had established it in the husk of a failed sugar plantation, its grand but decaying manor house repurposed to treat patients suffering from the region's relentless fevers and what were then termed nervous afflictions. From the outside, it projected an air of isolated authority, a bastion of modern medicine set against the encroaching chaos of the swamp. It promised healing and recovery in a land where death was an intimate, ever-present neighbor, drawing in the desperate from miles around. Roussel described the sanatorium's setting with a poet's eye for grim detail. The main house stood on a low rise of land, surrounded on three sides by the Bayou Noir, a deep, slow-moving channel of water so dark it seemed to swallow the light. Spanish moss hung from the ancient cypress trees like funeral shrouds, and the air was perpetually heavy with the scent of wet earth and blossoming decay. It was a place where the boundaries between land and water, life and death, felt unnervingly thin, a quality that Dr. Delacroix, Roussel noted, seemed to find deeply inspiring. The first letters reveal Roussel's complete admiration for the doctor. He writes of Delacroix's nightly lectures to the small staff, in which he would expound upon his theories. He speaks of medicine not as a trade, Roussel wrote, but as a philosophy, a means of restoring the divine balance between the body and the earth. Delacroix believed that civilization had made humanity weak, divorcing it from the natural cycles of growth and decay. True healing, he argued, could only be achieved by re-establishing that primal connection, a concept that sounded revolutionary and brilliant to his young assistant. Yet even in these early writings, there is a thread of unease. Roussel mentions the sanatorium's profound isolation, miles from the nearest settlement, a world unto itself, governed entirely by the doctor's singular vision. There were no outside visitors, and mail was collected only once a month. The staff was small and loyal, and the patients, once admitted, were completely cut off from their families. It was the perfect environment for a medical pioneer to conduct his work, free from the constraints of conventional oversight. It was also the perfect stage for a macabre mystery to unfold in complete secrecy. The autumn of 1843 brought with it a sickness that moved through the scattered settlements of St. Landry Parish like a phantom. It was a hemorrhagic fever, swift and brutal, that left its victims weakened and marked by internal bleeding. The local doctors, with their limited knowledge, were helpless against it. It was in this atmosphere of fear and desperation that the Sanatorium du Marais saw its patient rolls swell. Dr. Delacroix's reputation as a man of European learning made him seem like the only hope, and families sent their afflicted loved ones to him, praying for a scientific miracle. The first documented anomaly is recorded in a letter from Etienne Roussel, dated January 1844. It concerns the death of a young field hand, a man named Jean-Baptiste, who had succumbed to the fever after 3 days of agonizing illness. As was custom, Roussel and the other orderlies began preparing the body for a simple Christian burial, constructing a pine coffin for its return to the family. It was then that Dr. Delacroix intervened, his demeanor one of calm, unshakable authority. He forbade the coffin, dismissing it as an empty, sentimental ritual. Roussel's letter details the doctor's strange instructions with a growing sense of confusion. Delacroix ordered that the body be washed not with soap and water, but with a fragrant infusion of cypress oil and verbena. He then had it wrapped tightly in several layers of raw linen, like an ancient mummy. Finally, he instructed the orderlies to gather heavy stones from the bayou's edge and tie them securely to the shrouded corpse. He explained the procedure as a necessary public health measure, a way to prevent the miasma of the sickness from poisoning the soil of a traditional cemetery. He said a Christian burial was an arrogance, Roussel wrote to his brother, his words betraying his deep unease with the violation of sacred tradition. He claimed that the earth required a direct return, an unmediated offering, for the cycle of purification to be complete. And the doctor's reasoning was framed in the language of science and sanitation, a logic that was difficult to dispute, especially for a young man trained to defer to his superior's expertise. And so, under a sliver of a winter moon, Roussel and 2 other men carried the weighted body to the banks of the Bayou Noir. The scene, as Roussel describes it, is one of profound ritualistic stillness. Doctor Delacroix himself presided over the act, standing on the bank with his arms crossed, his silhouette a dark shape against the water's faint sheen. He offered no prayer, no final words of comfort. He simply watched as the men heaved their heavy burden into the waiting blackness. There was a loud splash, a brief disturbance of the surface, and then silence. The bayou swallowed the body whole, leaving behind no trace, only ripples that slowly faded into the darkness. Roussel tried to rationalize what he had seen. At the time, his logic seemed sound, if eccentric, he admitted in his letter. The fear of contagion was real, and the doctor's methods, however unorthodox, were presented as a radical but necessary precaution. In an age before a full understanding of germ theory, the idea of a sickness lingering in the soil was a powerful and terrifying one. Delacroix was merely taking that fear to its logical, if extreme, conclusion. It was a measure designed to protect the living, even if it dishonored the dead. But the image of the body sinking into the black water lingered in Roussel's mind. There was a finality to it that felt different from a burial. A grave could be visited, marked, remembered. The bayou, however, was a place of dissolution, of erasure. It was an act that seemed less about sanitation and more about oblivion. This was the first of many such disposals, the beginning of a pattern that would slowly transform the sanatorium from a place of healing into a place of methodical disappearance. The secret was kept within the sanatorium's small, isolated community. The family of Jean-Baptiste was simply told that he had been buried on the property in a private ceremony to prevent the spread of the fever, a sad but understandable necessity. They were given a small bundle of his personal effects and sent away with the doctor's condolences. There was no reason to doubt the word of such an esteemed man of science, and so the first anomaly was successfully concealed behind a wall of professional authority and feigned compassion. In the weeks that followed, as more patients succumbed to the fever, the ritual was repeated. Each body was prepared in the same meticulous way, wrapped in herb-infused linen, weighted with stones, and offered to the silent waiting waters of the Bayou Noir. For the staff, it became a grim, nocturnal routine, a task performed in hushed silence under the watchful eye of Dr. Delacroix. The hospital that had promised to save lives was now secretly erasing the evidence of its failures, one body at a time. By the bleak midwinter of 1844, the Sanatorium du Marais had become a place defined by a pervasive, unspoken dread. The initial wave of fever patients had been followed by others suffering from a host of ailments: consumption, dysentery, and melancholia. Yet, the outcome remained terrifyingly consistent. According to the sanatorium's own internal ledgers, meticulously kept by Roussel, not a single patient admitted after December of the previous year had recovered. The official cause of death was always listed as the original affliction, but the quiet accumulation of fatalities began to feel statistically impossible. Roussel's letters from this period document the grim escalation. By February, the death toll had risen to 7. None were returned to their families for burial. Each met the same fate as the first, their bodies consigned to the depths of the Bayou in clandestine moonlit ceremonies. The pretense of this being a mere sanitary measure was beginning to wear thin, even for the most loyal of the staff. The act felt too deliberate, too ritualistic. It was no longer a response to a crisis. It had become the institution's standard operating procedure for dealing with the dead. The doctor's philosophical pronouncements, once so inspiring to his young assistant, now took on a sinister tone. Roussel began to transcribe Delacroix's nightly lectures verbatim, as if seeking to find some hidden clue within the man's ornate, labyrinthine prose. "The swamp is not a grave, it is a womb," Delacroix declared one evening, his voice resonating in the humid air of the common room. "It digests impurities, it dissolves sin. What we call death is merely a reabsorption of failed material into the great creative matrix of the earth." This philosophy began to manifest in stranger, more disturbing ways. The documented anomalies were no longer confined to the disposal of human remains. A local trapper, a Cajun man who had navigated the surrounding wetlands his entire life, filed a formal complaint with the parish magistrate in Opelousas. He reported finding the carcasses of several large alligators and snapping turtles along the banks of the Bayou Noir, their tough hides laid open with what he described as clean cuts like a surgeon's knife. He claimed their internal organs had been removed with an unnatural precision. The complaint, which is still preserved in the parish archives, was treated with skepticism. The magistrate, a man with deep financial ties to the area's wealthy landowners, was not inclined to believe the rambling stories of an illiterate trapper over the word of a respected physician. Records show that Dr. Delacroix was called to give a statement. He calmly explained that he had been conducting anatomical studies on local fauna to better understand the region's unique physiology, all in the service of advancing medical science. His explanation was accepted without question. A few days later, parish financial records show a significant charitable donation was made by Dr. Delacroix to the magistrate's upcoming re-election campaign. The trapper's complaint was officially dismissed as a misunderstanding, a product of an uneducated mind misinterpreting the noble work of a man of science. The incident was a clear demonstration of the doctor's power and influence. He had effectively purchased a shield of impunity, ensuring that any further inconvenient questions from the outside world would be similarly deflected. Within the sanatorium, Delacroix began to speak of a new, more ambitious phase of his work. He referred to his patients not as people, but as biological subjects or vessels of corruption. He spoke of the fever not as a disease to be cured, but as a spiritual impurity to be purged. The language of medicine was slowly being replaced by the language of a dark, esoteric faith, with the doctor as its sole prophet and interpreter. The sanatorium was no longer a hospital. It was becoming a laboratory for one man's increasingly radical and dangerous ideas. Roussel's letters reflect his growing terror and his sense of being trapped. He was isolated, miles from any authority he could trust, and dependent on the very man he was beginning to fear. He describes staying awake at night, listening to the strange, unsettling sounds of the swamp, and wondering how many more secrets its black waters now held. He knew that something was deeply wrong, that the line between healing and destruction had been crossed, but he could not yet grasp the full, terrifying scope of the doctor's vision. The accumulation of these anomalies created an atmosphere of psychological suffocation. The staff moved about their duties with a quiet, fearful efficiency, avoiding eye contact, their silence a shared, unspoken admission of their complicity. They were all witnesses, and their silence was the price of their continued employment, and perhaps their safety. The macabre mystery of the sanatorium was no longer a question of what was happening to the dead, but what was being planned for the living. As the winter of 1844 bled into a damp, oppressive spring, Etienne Roussel's role transformed from that of a dutiful assistant to a clandestine investigator. His admiration for Dr. Delacroix had curdled into a deep and abiding fear, compelling him to seek answers in the only place he could, the doctor's private library. Late at night, while the sanatorium slept, Roussel would slip into the leather-scented quiet of the study, a single candle casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He was searching for a medical rationale for the doctor's actions, some text that could explain the bizarre turn his science had taken. What he found, however, only deepened the mystery. The shelves were filled not just with the expected medical journals from Paris and Vienna, but with a far more eclectic and disturbing collection. There were volumes on medieval alchemy, tracts on pre-Christian European sacrificial rites, and philosophical treatises on the nature of miasma and spiritual decay. Delacroix's interests were not confined to the physical body. He was studying the very essence of corruption, both material and metaphysical. The doctor was not just a physician, he was an occultist. This discovery became the catalyst for Roussel's first terrifying hypothesis. In a long, desperate letter to his brother in New Orleans, dated March 1844, he laid out his fears, the words tumbling onto the page in a torrent of horrified realization. He connected the secret burials, the mutilated animals, and the esoteric texts, weaving them together into a narrative that was no longer about medicine. He finally understood that the disposals in the Bayou were not a desperate measure to prevent contagion. They were a central part of the treatment itself. "He is not preventing contagion," Roussel wrote, the urgency evident in his script. "He is performing a ritual." He speaks of the fever as a spiritual corruption that the body expels in the form of blood. He believes the swamp, in its primordial power, devours what he calls physical evil. This is not medicine. This is a sacrifice, and he has appointed himself its high priest. The hypothesis once formed was irrefutable. It explained everything. The doctor's serene, almost beatific demeanor during the nocturnal disposals, his obsession with the swamp's digestive properties, his cold detachment from the suffering of his patients. This theory finds its most chilling confirmation in a document that would not be discovered for another 100 years, a fragment of Dr. Delacroix's own personal diary, found preserved in a sealed jar during the 1962 excavation. The entry, penned in the same month as Roussel's letter, reveals the doctor's messianic delusion in his own words. "I merely hasten the cycle," the diary reads. "The swamp accepts the offering and restores the balance of this corrupted land. They see me as a healer, but my work is more profound. I am its instrument, a humble servant to a power far greater than their fragile faith. Roussel's understanding of the situation was now horribly clear. He was not working in a hospital of horrors, but a temple. The patients were not being treated, they were being prepared as offerings. The doctor's entire enterprise, from the sanatorium's isolation to its carefully selected staff, was designed to facilitate this dark work, free from the prying eyes of a world that would never understand his grand, terrible vision. The science he practiced was merely a veneer, a respectable mask for a deeply archaic and brutal belief system. This partial revelation was a turning point for Roussel. He was no longer just a frightened observer. He was the sole witness to a series of methodical, ritualistic killings. His presence at the sanatorium was no longer a matter of employment, but of profound moral jeopardy. Every day he remained, every task he performed, he was participating in the doctor's profane rites. The weight of this knowledge was immense, a burden that isolated him completely within the already isolated world of the sanatorium. He began to observe his fellow staff members with new eyes, wondering how much they knew or how much they allowed themselves to know. He saw the same fear and avoidance in their faces, the same desperate commitment to the routine of their daily chores, a routine that kept them from having to confront the true nature of their work. They were all trapped in the doctor's orbit, bound by a combination of fear, loyalty, and the simple pragmatic need for survival in a harsh and unforgiving world. The first hypothesis, born in the flickering candlelight of the doctor's library, had opened a chasm in Roussel's understanding of reality. He was standing on the edge of a madness that was all the more terrifying for its cold, intellectual precision. Doctor. Delacroix was not a ranting lunatic. He was a methodical, patient, and utterly convinced visionary, and his vision required a steady, unending supply of human sacrifices for the purification of the world. As spring deepened, the unease that had been confined within the walls of the sanatorium began to seep out into the surrounding community. The sheer number of people who had entered Dr. Delacroix's care and never returned could no longer be dismissed as the unfortunate but expected outcome of a virulent fever. A quiet, fearful narrative began to take shape among the scattered homesteads and trappers' camps of St. Landry Parish. The Sanatorium du Marais was becoming known as a place of disappearance, a final destination from which there was no correspondence, no recovery, no return. The social fracture first appears in the official record through the pen of Reverend Michel, the local parish priest. A deeply devout and compassionate man, he had begun to hear disturbing whispers during confession and pastoral visits. His flock was afraid. In a letter addressed to his bishop in the distant city of Lafayette, he carefully documented the growing panic. He wrote of families who had received only a cold, formal notice of a loved one's death, with no body to mourn and no grave to visit. Screams are heard from the direction of the Bayou at night, the Reverend wrote, his careful script conveying a deep and troubled conscience. The doctor is a man of science and by all accounts of great charity to our parish. But his methods are opaque, and his institution is a fortress of secrecy. My flock is afraid. They speak of the sanatorium in hushed tones, and some have begun to say that the water of the Bayou Noir itself has grown sick, that it has taken too many of our dead. The bishop's archives in Lafayette contain no record of a reply. The church, like the civil authorities, was an institution that valued order and deference to men of status. Dr. Delacroix was not just a physician, he was a benefactor. His regular and generous donations to the parish church documented in the same ledgers that recorded baptisms and funerals, had purchased him a powerful measure of institutional grace. An investigation based on the superstitious fears of uneducated countryfolk would have been seen as an ungrateful and disruptive act. This wall of silence from the authorities only amplified the fear among the local population. With no official recourse, they turned to superstition and folklore to explain the inexplicable. Stories began to circulate of a feu follet, a ghostly light seen dancing over the surface of the Bayou Noir at night. Trappers spoke of a chilling silence that had fallen over that stretch of the swamp, as if the birds and animals had fled from some unseen malevolence. The sanatorium became a haunted place in the local imagination, a nexus of dark energy. Dr. Delacroix, for his part, seemed entirely untroubled by the growing rumors. He remained a figure of impeccable public grace, occasionally visiting the nearby town for supplies, his demeanor always calm, professional and compassionate. He would inquire after the health of the townspeople, offer free medical advice, and make his customary donations, all while knowing that the very people he spoke to were beginning to whisper about him in the shadows. His confidence was the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. Within the sanatorium, Roussel documented this growing schism in his letters. He was now a prisoner in a more profound sense, caught between the terrifying reality inside the walls and a community outside that was too frightened and powerless to intervene. His own isolation was complete. "They look at me in the village as the doctor's shadow," he wrote. "They do not speak to me, but I see the questions in their eyes. I am complicit in my silence, yet to speak out is to accuse a man seen as a savior. I am caught between a monster and a world that refuses to see him." The social fracture was not just between the community and the sanatorium, but within the community itself. Those who defended the doctor, who pointed to his education and his charity, began to argue with those who believed the dark rumors. Friendships were strained, and a subtle paranoia crept into the parish. The hidden horror of Delacroix's actions was creating echoes of distrust and division, poisoning the social fabric of the entire region from its dark, isolated heart. The failure of the church and the state to investigate created a vacuum of authority, a space in which fear was allowed to fester and grow. It was a classic case of institutional denial, where the comfort of the status quo and the influence of a powerful individual outweighed the desperate whispers of the marginalized. The community was left to police its own fears, and the sanatorium was allowed to continue its terrible work, protected by a carefully constructed facade of respectability and the willful blindness of those in power. The fine, almost invisible line separating Delacroix's philosophy from outright murder was finally irrevocably crossed on a humid night in April 1844. The horror was no longer confined to the disposal of the dead. It now extended to the deliberate taking of a life, an act that stripped away the last vestiges of medical justification and revealed the sanatorium's true purpose. For Etienne Roussel, this event was a point of no return, a trauma that would shatter his conscience and force him to confront the absolute evil he was serving. The victim was a young man named Antoine, a patient suffering from a severe delirium brought on by his fever. He was prone to fits of shouting and thrashing, his mind lost in a landscape of imagined terrors. For weeks he had been restrained in his bed, his cries a constant unnerving presence in the sanatorium's long, dark hallways. On this particular night, his struggles were especially violent, his voice raw from screaming. It was then that Dr. Delacroix appeared at his bedside, his face a mask of serene, clinical resolve. Roussel's letter describing the event is written with a hand that visibly trembles, the ink blotted and smeared in several places. He watched from the shadows of the hallway as the doctor, with the help of two burly orderlies, unstrapped the still protesting patient from his bed. Antoine was alive, his eyes wide with a terror that was all too real. He fought against their grip, but his weakened body was no match for their combined strength. They began to carry him out of the ward, his bare feet dragging on the rough wooden floor. The doctor told the orderlies that his fever had destroyed his reason beyond repair, Roussel wrote, the words a frantic scrawl. He said that his spirit was already lost, and only the deep medicine of the water could now bring him peace. They were not taking him to another room for treatment. They were carrying him out into the night, toward the Bayou. He was not wrapped in linen. He was alive. This was the irrefutable evidence. It was not euthanasia. It was an execution, carried out under the guise of a mystical cure. The impact on Roussel was immediate and profound. He describes hiding in his small room, his hands pressed over his ears to block out the sound of Antoine's fading screams, and then the inevitable sickening splash. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. It was the sound of a life extinguished, of a moral boundary crossed from which there could be no retreat. In his letter, he confesses his own cowardice, his paralysis in the face of such horror. "I have now crossed a line from which my soul can never return," he wrote. "I have witnessed a murder, and I did nothing." This event solidified his conviction. There was no more room for doubt, no possibility of misinterpreting the doctor's intentions. Delacroix was not just a philosopher with eccentric methods. He was a serial killer, operating with the cold, detached precision of a surgeon. His sanatorium was his private abattoir, his patients the unwilling subjects of his fatal experiments in spiritual purification. The entire enterprise was a meticulously constructed machine for the commission and concealment of murder. The psychological toll on Roussel is evident in the tone of his subsequent writings. The detached observational style of his earlier letters gives way to a raw, desperate urgency. He understood that his own life was now in danger. He knew too much. He had become a liability, the only person within the doctor's inner circle who had not been fully indoctrinated into the cult of the swamp. His complicity had been transformed into a threat, and he knew that Delacroix was not a man who would tolerate threats. He began to see the doctor's every action through a new lens of terror. A calm word of instruction, a paternalistic hand on the shoulder. These were no longer gestures of professional camaraderie, but the calculated movements of a predator. He felt the doctor's eyes on him, studying him, gauging his loyalty and his breaking point. The sanatorium, once a place of scientific promise, had become a cage, and Roussel knew he had to find a way to escape before he, too, became a subject for the Bayou's deep medicine. The murder of Antoine was the final piece of the puzzle, the irrefutable evidence that confirmed Roussel's worst fears. It was an act of supreme arrogance, a demonstration of Delacroix's belief in his own absolute authority over life and death. He had moved beyond simply managing the dead. He was now actively selecting who would live and who would be sacrificed to his dark, insatiable god, the all-consuming, all-purifying swamp. Driven by the horror of what he had witnessed and the primal fear for his own life, Etienne Roussel made a decision that would seal the fate of the sanatorium. He could no longer be a silent accomplice. He had to break the wall of isolation that Delacroix had so carefully constructed around his domain. His conscience, shattered by the murder of Antoine, now demanded action. He resolved to alert the only authority that might be able to challenge the doctor on his own terms, the New Orleans Medical Society. Knowing that a letter bearing his own name would be intercepted or dismissed, Roussel composed a detailed, damning account of the practices at the sanatorium and sent it anonymously. He painstakingly documented the consistent pattern of patient deaths, the secret nocturnal burials in the Bayou, and the doctor's increasingly bizarre philosophical justifications. He described, in chilling detail, the recent event involving the delirious but living patient being taken to the water. It was a comprehensive indictment, a plea for intervention from a desperate, unseen witness. The official archives of the New Orleans Medical Society preserved the minutes from their subsequent meeting in early May 1844. The document records the committee's reaction to the anonymous letter. There was considerable debate. Doctor Delacroix was a known quantity, a man whose European credentials and professional reputation were, on paper, impeccable. The claims made in the letter were so extreme, so beyond the pale of accepted medical practice, that they bordered on the unbelievable. It was the story of a madman, not a respected physician. A disturbing letter was received concerning the practices of Dr. A. Delacroix of St. Landry Parish, the minutes read in their dry, formal script. While the claims are extreme and their anonymous nature makes them suspect, the level of detail provided is cause for concern. His Parisian education and Lyon residency commend him to our society. It is therefore resolved that a two-man investigative committee will be dispatched to the Sanatorium du Marais to ascertain the facts of the matter at their earliest convenience. The collapse of authority is evident in those final, fatal words, at their earliest convenience. The institutional inertia, the deference to a colleague's reputation, and the logistical difficulty of travel to the remote parish all conspired to create a deadly delay. Parish records from the time show that the investigator's journey was not scheduled for another month. The society had received a credible report of a potential serial killer operating a private hospital, and their response was to schedule a visit. The system, designed to protect professional integrity, was failing to protect human lives. This delay provided Delacroix with a crucial window of time. It is unclear if he ever learned of the impending investigation, but his actions in the following weeks suggest a man either sensing a threat or hastening to complete a final, grand phase of his work. Roussel's letters from this period cease, suggesting he had either fled or been silenced. The sanatorium was now a black box, its inner workings known only to the doctor and his most loyal or most terrified staff. The true collapse of authority, however, was not institutional, but natural. As the New Orleans physicians made their slow, deliberate preparations, the Louisiana weather was gathering its own inexorable force. The spring had been unusually wet, the ground saturated, and the bayous swollen. A powerful storm system was churning in the Gulf, and its immense power was about to be unleashed on the low-lying lands of the parish, an act of nature that would inadvertently serve as the final, chaotic arbiter of justice. The failure of the medical society to act with urgency stands as a stark indictment of the era's professional culture. Their caution and procedural correctness were, in effect, a form of complicity. They possessed the authority to intervene, to demand access, to stop the horror that Roussel had so clearly described, but their deference to a fellow member of their elite fraternity, their unwillingness to believe that one of their own could be capable of such atrocities, allowed the killing to continue. In this sense, the authority of the institution collapsed long before the floodwaters rose. It collapsed in a committee room in New Orleans, in a decision to treat an urgent cry for help as a matter for routine inquiry. It was a moral collapse, a failure of imagination and courage. The established systems of oversight, The very structures meant to prevent such abuses of power proved to be little more than a fragile bureaucracy, easily bypassed by a determined and charismatic monster. In the tense, uncertain weeks following his letter to the medical society, Etienne Roussel made a discovery that would reframe the entire horrific picture. It was a human discovery, not a textual one, and it shifted the nature of Delacroix's evil from the philosophical to the deeply, monstrously personal. His attention had been drawn to Sabine, a freed black midwife who Dr. Delacroix had employed for her encyclopedic knowledge of the region's native botany. She was a quiet, dignified woman, respected in the community for her skills as a healer. Sabine had initially been a collaborator, assisting the doctor in preparing herbal infusions and poultices for the patients. She moved through the sanatorium with a serene grace, a calming presence amidst the pervasive atmosphere of fear. But Roussel began to notice a subtle change in her demeanor. He saw a watchfulness in her eyes, a careful, guarded quality to her movements. She had grown quieter, more withdrawn, and he often saw her casting anxious glances toward the doctor's office. One evening, while helping her tidy the small infirmary where the herbs were stored, Roussel noticed her press a hand to her lower abdomen, a gesture that was both protective and weary. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but in the hypervigilant environment of the sanatorium, it was a revelation. He realized two things in a single chilling moment of clarity. Sabine was pregnant, and the source of her growing fear was the doctor himself. Her knowledge was no longer a resource for him, her body had become a subject. This discovery of a hidden source of life within the House of Death unlocked a new and terrifying understanding of Delacroix's ambitions. Roussel began to recall snatches of the doctor's lectures, phrases that had previously seemed like abstract philosophical ramblings. He had spoken of the vessel and the seed of terrestrial germination, and of the possibility of creating a purer form of life from the purified essence of the swamp. Roussel now understood that these were not metaphors. Delacroix's interest in Sabine's condition was not that of a concerned physician. It was predatory, clinical, and obsessive. He was not interested in the health of the mother or the child. He was interested in the process of gestation itself. Sabine, in her profound connection to the cycles of life and her knowledge of the Earth's healing properties, represented everything Delacroix sought to control and redefine. She was the embodiment of the natural world he both worshipped and sought to dominate. Roussel confirmed his fears a few nights later. He crept to her small room in the servants' quarters, intending to warn her, to offer whatever help he could. He found the room empty, but discovered a small, tightly wrapped bundle of herbs and carved wooden charms hidden beneath her thin mattress. It was a protective ward, a collection of traditional folk magic intended to ward off evil. In a place supposedly governed by modern science, Sabine had turned to the old ways to protect herself and her unborn child from the man of medicine. This hidden source, Sabine's pregnancy, was the key. Delacroix's experiments were not just about a philosophy of death and purification. They were about the creation of life. He was not merely sacrificing the corrupted. He was seeking to harness the very energies of life and death to create something new, something born of his own twisted vision. The sanatorium was not just an altar, it was a laboratory for a grotesque form of eugenics, and Sabine and her child were to be his ultimate experiment. The full, monstrous scope of the doctor's plan was now laid bare. He intended to perform his own version of Genesis, using the nutrient-rich slurry of dissolved human remains from the Bayou as a fertilizer, a medium through which a new, purified life could be germinated. The infant separated from its impure mother would be the first of this new creation. It was a plan of such profound scientific madness that it defied all rational comprehension. The discovery of Sabine's quiet, desperate attempts to protect herself transformed the narrative from one of systemic horror to one of intimate, impending tragedy. She was no longer just a background figure, another potential victim. She was now the focal point of the story's moral climax, a symbol of life and hope, trapped in the clutches of a man who saw her only as a biological vessel for his insane ambitions. The realization of Delacroix's ultimate design for Sabine and her unborn child galvanized Etienne Roussel, transforming his passive fear into a desperate, active resolve. He could not wait for the slow, uncertain justice of the New Orleans Medical Society. He could not stand by and watch this final, most horrific act of violation unfold. He had been a witness and an unwilling accomplice for too long. He now had to become a savior. His decision for decisive action is laid out in his final, breathless letter to his brother. This last piece of correspondence is not a report or a confession. It is a plan, a hastily scrawled justification for what he was about to do. The tone is no longer one of despair, but of a grim, focused determination. He recognized that there was no reasoning with Delacroix, no appealing to a shared humanity that the doctor no longer possessed. The only course of action left was escape, a desperate flight from the sanatorium's suffocating grip, taking Sabine with him. "I must get Sabine away from this place," he wrote, the urgency of his mission conveyed in every stroke of his pen. The doctor's interest in her condition has become clinical, predatory. He speaks of the vessel and the seed in his notes. He is not her physician, he is her captor. His philosophy has ripened into a monstrous obsession with her and the life she carries. He watches her constantly. I fear he will not wait for the natural term of her pregnancy. The letter details the practicalities of his plan. He had been secretly saving a portion of his wages, and he had used it to purchase a sturdy horse from a farmer several miles away, stabling it in a hidden grove deep in the woods. He had gathered a small supply of dried food and a water skin. He describes his intention to wait for the new moon, when the nights were at their darkest, to slip out of the sanatorium with Sabine and ride for the relative safety of a distant parish where they would not be known. His justification for this drastic action is rooted in a profound sense of personal responsibility. He saw this not just as an act of rescue, but as an act of atonement for his own prolonged silence. He felt that his inaction had, in some way, enabled the doctor's atrocities, and that saving Sabine and her child was the only way he could hope to reclaim some small part of his own shattered soul. It was a dangerous, almost suicidal plan, but it was the only morally tenable option left to him. "I have secured a horse and will lead it to the edge of the property after midnight," the plan continues. "We will leave under the cover of the new moon. The journey will be perilous, but to remain here is certain death for her and likely for me. If we should fail, if we are discovered, this letter is my testimony. Her name is Sabine. She is a healer and a mother. Remember her." These final words are a poignant acknowledgement of the immense risk he was undertaking, an attempt to ensure that even in death, Sabine's story would not be erased. The suspense of the narrative is built through this cold, methodical detailing of his preparations. The reader is placed directly into Roussel's desperate state of mind, acutely aware of the stakes. Every creaking floorboard, every unexpected sound in the night becomes a potential threat. The sanatorium is no longer just a place of philosophical horror. It is the setting for a tense life-or-death escape, a race against time and the ever-watchful eyes of Dr. Delacroix. This decision represents the climax of Roussel's own moral journey. He transforms from a passive, terrified witness into an active agent of defiance. He chooses to risk everything, his career, his freedom, his life, for a principle. It is a singular act of courage in a world defined by complicity and fear. He is no longer the Doctor's shadow. He is his sworn enemy, fighting to save the one thing the Doctor's philosophy could not comprehend: the sanctity of a human life. The letter ends abruptly, without a formal closing, as if the author was interrupted or had to hide it quickly. It is the last known communication from Etienne Roussel. What happened next, whether the escape was attempted, whether it succeeded or failed, is not recorded in his hand. The answer would only come later, delivered not by a human witness, but by the indifferent, cleansing violence of the flood. When the investigative committee from the New Orleans Medical Society finally reached St. Landry Parish in late May of 1844, they were met not with a functioning sanatorium, but with a scene of biblical devastation. A hurricane had swept in from the Gulf, stalling over the region and unleashing days of torrential rain. The bayous had overflowed their banks, and a sudden violent flash flood had torn through the low-lying lands, reshaping the very geography of the parish. Their journey to the sanatorium was a slow, difficult trek through a landscape of mud, debris, and standing water. The final primary source of the events at the sanatorium is the official report filed by these investigators. It is a document written in the detached clinical language of men of science, yet it fails to conceal their profound shock at what they discovered. The report describes the sanatorium as a ruin, its ground floor completely inundated, its foundations washed away. Hospital beds, medical equipment, and personal effects were scattered across the property, half buried in a thick layer of brown, foul-smelling silt. The building is half submerged in mud and appears to be structurally unsound, the report states. But the most disturbing discovery was in the adjacent Bayou Noir. We counted 20 decomposing bodies floating in the floodwaters, snagged on cypress knees and low-hanging branches. The state of decay suggests they have been in the water for varying lengths of time, some for several weeks, others more recent. Dr. Delacroix is nowhere to be found. The flood, in its violent churning, had forced the bayou to give up its dead, revealing the true scale of the massacre. The investigators made their way into the only part of the main house that had remained miraculously untouched by the water, the doctor's private office on the second floor. The room was in perfect order, as if its owner had just stepped out for a moment, and there, on the surface of his large mahogany desk, lay his personal diary, open to its final chilling entry. The handwriting was calm and steady, the words of a man utterly at peace with the chaos he had wrought and the devastation that was about to consume him. The diary entry serves as Delacroix's final, unrepentant confession. "The great purification has come," he wrote. "The heavens have opened, and the waters rise to claim them all, to wash the land clean. The bayou swells to become an ocean, a great baptismal font for this corrupted earth. My work is complete. They are at peace now, taken into the great womb of the world. The earth has taken them." There was no remorse, no fear, only a sense of triumphant messianic fulfillment. It is believed he allowed himself to be consumed by the flood, a final sacrifice to the entity he worshipped. But the most horrific revelation was yet to come. Days later, as the grim work of recovering and identifying the bodies was underway, the local coroner performed an autopsy on a female victim who was identified by a small silver locket found around her neck as the midwife, Sabine. The coroner's report, with its cold, scientific precision, provides the story's ultimate horror, the final interpretation of Delacroix's great work. The subject was a female of African descent, approximate age 30, the report reads. The subject was approximately 8 months pregnant at the time of death. Examination reveals that the cause of death was not drowning, but exsanguination resulting from severe trauma to the abdomen and uterus. The evidence is consistent with a forced, premature, and surgically performed delivery of the fetus. The infant is not accounted for. This final, terrible piece of evidence casts all the preceding events in a new and even more sinister light. Delacroix's final act was not merely another murder, it was the culmination of his life's work. He had performed a crude, fatal caesarean section on Sabine, harvesting her child for his insane experiment in terrestrial germination. The 20 bodies in the Bayou were the discarded raw material. The infant was to be the final product, the first citizen of his new, purified world. The fate of the infant remains one of the story's most haunting, unanswered questions. Did Delacroix sacrifice the child to the flood as well, a final, pure offering? Or did it perish in the chaos of its violent birth? No remains were ever found. The story of the sanatorium thus ends not with an explanation, but with a profound and terrible absence, an infant born of violence who vanished into the storm, its existence documented only in a coroner's dispassionate report on the body of its murdered mother. In the aftermath of the flood and the grim discoveries at the Sanatorium du Marais, a curtain of official silence descended upon the affair. The case was a source of profound embarrassment for the New Orleans Medical Society, a horrific stain on their professional reputation. The final report concluded that Dr. Delacroix, presumed dead in the flood, had been suffering from a severe mental decline, and that the events at the sanatorium were the tragic actions of a single, deranged individual. The matter was officially closed. The name of Dr. Alphonse Delacroix was quietly struck from the Society's rolls. His academic papers were removed from their library, and his professional legacy was systematically erased. For the official record, the brilliant physician from Paris and Lyon had never existed. He became a historical ghost, a cautionary tale whispered among senior physicians, but never committed to print. The institution, in an act of self-preservation, chose to bury the crime rather than confront its own failure of oversight. Etienne Roussel also vanishes from all historical records after his final desperate letter. His fate remains a mystery. Did he manage to escape the sanatorium before the flood, disappearing into the vastness of the American frontier to live out his life under a new name? Or was he discovered by Delacroix and became the final victim to be fed to the Bayou? With no body ever recovered and no further correspondence found, his courageous act of defiance ends in an unresolved, echoing silence. For the community of St. Landry Parish, the story of the sanatorium passed from horrific fact into the realm of folklore. The ruined building was shunned, believed to be cursed, and was eventually dismantled for salvage by locals, its materials scattered across the parish. The land was left fallow, and the Bayou Noir became a place of profound superstition, a stretch of water that even the bravest trappers would not navigate after dark. The hidden story of the hospital became a ghost story, a tool used by parents to frighten their children into obedience. The legend persisted for over a century, a vague and distorted memory of a great evil. People spoke of the Bayou breathing at night, of strange bubbles rising to the surface that smelled of iron and sickness. They told stories of a mad doctor who made pacts with dark spirits in the swamp. The historical truth, with its specific victims and its cold, clinical horror, was lost, replaced by the more palatable supernatural narrative of a haunted place. The buried secret of the sanatorium was kept not in archives, but in the oral tradition of a frightened community. The names of the victims, the 20 individuals whose bodies were pulled from the floodwaters, were never fully recorded. Most were transient patients or impoverished locals whose disappearances were barely noted. They became an anonymous statistic, the collateral damage of one man's madness. Only Sabine, through the coroner's report and Roussel's letters, retains a semblance of an identity. She is remembered not for her life as a healer, but for her horrific death as a biological specimen. The sanatorium itself was slowly reclaimed by the swamp. Its foundations disappeared under a century of silt and vegetation, its memory fading with each passing generation. The crime, it seemed, had been successfully erased, first by institutional denial and then by the slow, inexorable work of nature. The case of the doctor who fed his patients to the swamp was forgotten by history, a dark chapter that remained unwritten, its full truth sealed in the earth. This legacy of silence and erasure is perhaps the most profound consequence of the whole affair. It demonstrates how easily a community's trauma can be dismissed and buried by those in power. The official narrative, a tragic flood and an insane doctor, was a convenient fiction that allowed society to avoid confronting a more disturbing truth, that a monster had been allowed to operate in their midst, protected by the very institutions meant to restrain him. The silence was only broken in 1962 with the accidental discovery of the cistern. The physical evidence, the bones and the instruments forced a historical reckoning. It dragged the forgotten story back into the light, demanding that the whispers and legends be replaced with a documented account of what truly happened. The legacy of the sanatorium, it turned out, was not just folklore. It was a buried crime scene, waiting patiently for its exhumation. The rediscovery of the Sanatorium du Marais in 1962 initiated a new chapter in its dark history, one of academic analysis and forensic investigation. Among the many artifacts recovered from the mud-filled cistern, the most perplexing was a large, sealed glass jar. Inside, protected from the elements, were the water-damaged but partially legible fragments of Dr. Delacroix's final scientific manuscripts. These pages provided a terrifying insight into the full, systematic nature of his philosophy. The surviving texts, painstakingly restored by archivists, detail his ultimate theory, which he called terrestrial germination. It was a grotesque vision of reincarnation, grounded in a twisted application of biological science. He believed that by dissolving human bodies in the nutrient-rich anaerobic mud of the Bayou, he was creating a primal slurry, a fertile medium from which a new, purer form of human life could be cultivated. The bodies were not sacrifices in a religious sense. They were compost for his garden of flesh. His notes describe a meticulous, multi-stage process. He wrote of the need to select corrupted vessels for dissolution and a pure vessel for gestation. He theorized that an infant, brought to term and then nourished with substances derived from the primal slurry, would be free from the physical and spiritual decay of modern humanity. It was the work of a man who sought to replace God's creation with his own, using murder as an instrument of eugenics. The forced delivery of Sabine's child was to be his first successful experiment. This understanding casts Delacroix not as a simple madman, but as a chilling precursor to the scientific horrors of the 20th century. He was a man who used the language and methods of science to pursue a goal of profound ideological evil. His work existed at a terrible intersection of reason and madness, a place where the quest for knowledge becomes unmoored from all ethical and moral constraints. He was a monster, but a monster with a clear, internally consistent and terrifyingly modern philosophy. But the final report from the LSU archaeological team, published in 1965, contains a deeply unsettling addendum, a single paragraph that pushes the story from the historical into the present. The forensic analysis of the soil samples taken from around the cistern revealed something that should not have been there. Alongside the expected chemical traces from the 1840s, the tests detected significant concentrations of modern formaldehyde and calcium hypochlorite. These are chemical preservatives that were not invented until decades after Delacroix's time. Their presence in the soil layers was a physical impossibility unless one considered a terrifying alternative. The report concludes with a sentence of stark, clinical understatement. The evidence is consistent with the clandestine and relatively recent disposal of preserved organic matter at the site. The work, it seems, may have been continued long after the sanatorium was destroyed. This open question transforms the legacy of Dr. Delacroix. He was not just a forgotten historical monster, he may have been the founder of a dark tradition. Did his writings survive in some other form? Did he have a secret apprentice who escaped the flood and carried on his work? Or did someone, generations later, rediscover his philosophy and begin the sacrifices anew? The chemical evidence suggests that someone in the modern era has been feeding the swamp. The story, therefore, does not end in 1844, nor in 1962. It ends now with an unresolved and deeply disturbing possibility. The local legends of the Bayou breathing at night, of its waters smelling of decay, may not be folklore after all. They may be the observations of witnesses to an ongoing hidden crime. The sins of Dr. Delacroix were not washed away by the flood. They soaked into the very earth, leaving behind a legacy of methodical evil that may still be active today. What remains is a history that is chillingly incomplete. The final truth of the Sanatorium du Marais is not just what happened in the past, but what might still be happening in the present. The open question hangs in the humid Louisiana air, a testament to the enduring power of a monstrous idea and the disquieting possibility that some buried secrets refuse to stay dead. The case is closed, but the mystery endures, its roots deep in the black mud of the Bayou Noir. The darkest chapters of history are not those that are written in blood, but those that are written in silence. The story of Dr. Delacroix reminds us that the greatest evils often wear the mask of progress and reason. If you believe these forgotten stories must be brought into the light, then join our mission. Subscribe to Before the Store. The past is never truly past, and there are always more secrets waiting to be unearthed.